Who would have thought that a millionaire could sit in a small city clinic, pretending to be just another patient? Nicholas Hale wore an old sweater, waited in a crowded hallway, and no one guessed who he really was. But everything changed when a little girl tugged on his sleeve, looked up with wide eyes, and whispered one word, "Daddy." Her nurse mother froze, the room fell silent, and what followed was not just a mistake. It was the beginning of something that would transform all three of their lives forever. Before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from. Enjoy the story, everyone. The fluorescent lights of the clinic buzzed faintly, casting a pale glow over the worn linoleum floors. Nicholas Hale sat in a corner chair, the kind with chipped plastic armrests that had endured years of restless patients and worried parents. He slouched slightly, blending into the sea of weary faces, wearing nothing more than an old gray sweater and jeans that looked a size too big. For the first time in years, nobody stared at him, nobody whispered his name, nobody treated him like a headline. To them, he was just another man waiting for his number to be called. That was exactly what he wanted. For months, Nicholas had lived with a growing ache inside him. Not physical, but something deeper, hollow, gnawing. Since the sudden death of his wife, the world had blurred into board meetings, shareholder calls, and shallow dinners with people who wanted his signature more than his smile. His fortune was vast, his name inescapable. Yet sitting in the back seat of black limousines, surrounded by glass towers and polished marble floors, he felt like a ghost walking through a life he no longer recognized. So tonight he left it all behind. No driver, no expensive watch, no tailored suit, just Nicholas, stripped of everything that made him Nicholas Hale the tycoon. He wanted to know what it felt like to be invisible, to breathe the same tired air as everyone else, to sit under the same flickering lights where no one expected anything from him. The waiting room was full of small sounds: the squeak of rubber shoes against the floor, the rattle of a vending machine, the faint hum of a toddler playing with a toy car in the corner. Across from Nicholas sat an elderly man with a cane, coughing into a handkerchief. Beside him, a young mother hushed her baby with a lullaby that sounded both soothing and exhausted. Nicholas leaned back, closed his eyes for a moment, and almost allowed himself to believe he was just another face in the crowd. That was when he felt it, a small tug on his sleeve. His eyes opened and he looked down. A little girl stood beside him, no more than 5 or 6 years old. Her hair was the color of autumn wheat, tied into 2 uneven pigtails with pink bands. In one hand she clutched a crumpled drawing. In the other she clung to a stuffed rabbit missing one ear. Her wide hazel eyes studied his face with unsettling seriousness, like she had been searching for someone and suddenly found him. "Daddy?" she whispered. The word sliced through the room like a bell. Conversation stilled. The coughs and whispers quieted. People glanced up, curious, suspicious. Nicholas froze. He hadn't been called that word in years. His throat tightened, his heart hammered in his chest, and for a brief second he almost believed her. Before he could speak, a woman rushed forward. Her scrubs were a little wrinkled, her hair tied back in a hurried bun, a stethoscope swinging loosely around her neck. Her badge read Claire Bennett. Her face flushed crimson as she knelt beside the girl. "Sophie," she whispered urgently. "No, sweetheart, that's not." She looked up at Nicholas, mortified. "I'm so sorry. She doesn't know." Nicholas blinked, still trying to steady himself. "It's all right," he murmured. His voice came out softer than he expected. "Really?" Claire scooped Sophie into her arms, but the little girl wriggled, eyes fixed on Nicholas with stubborn certainty. "But he looks like Daddy," she insisted, clutching her drawing. Nicholas glanced at the paper in her small hand. It was a simple crayon sketch. A house with a crooked roof, a smiling stick-figure mother, a smaller girl with pigtails, and beside them, a tall figure drawn with no face, just an outline, a shadow of someone missing. He swallowed hard. Claire's eyes flickered with a mix of embarrassment and something else. Fatigue, maybe, or the pain of explaining the same absence too many times. "She's never had a father," she said quickly, as if defending herself from some unseen judgment. "Sometimes she just imagines." Nicholas met the girl's gaze again. Sophie wasn't embarrassed at all. She simply studied him with a kind of quiet hope that pierced through his carefully built walls. He could have corrected her, brushed it off, turned away. But something inside him cracked open. "Well," Nicholas said slowly, managing a small smile, "if I look like him, then I hope he's a good man." Sophie's face lit up as if he had given her the sun. Claire blinked, caught off guard by the warmth in his tone. For a man she assumed was just another patient. He carried himself with an odd gravity, as though even in faded clothes, the air bent around him. Still, she reminded herself he was a stranger, just a stranger. "Thank you for understanding," she said quietly, tugging Sophie closer. "It's been hard for her." Nicholas nodded, though the ache in his chest deepened. Hard for her, yes, but maybe in some way hard for him too. And as Sophie leaned her head on her mother's shoulder, eyes still locked on him, Nicholas realized something he hadn't felt in years. He didn't feel invisible anymore. Claire adjusted Sophie on her hip, trying to quiet the little girl's stubborn protests. But Sophie's eyes never left Nicholas, as though she had already decided something her mother couldn't undo. "I'm really sorry," Claire said again, her voice steadier this time. "She gets confused. I should have been watching her more closely." Nicholas shook his head. "Please, don't apologize. She didn't do anything wrong." He meant it. Children had a way of cutting through the noise of the world, of saying the one thing adults were too careful or too broken to say. That one word, "daddy," had stirred something in him he hadn't let himself feel in years. Sophie wriggled again, determined to be heard. "Can he sit with us, Mommy?" Claire blinked, caught between disbelief and embarrassment. "Sweetheart, he has his own seat." "But he's lonely," Sophie said with a certainty only a child could muster. "He looks lonely." Nicholas almost laughed, except the words landed like a stone in his chest. Out of the mouths of babes, he thought. Claire gave him a quick, apologetic glance, her cheeks coloring. She wanted to scold Sophie, to hush her curiosity, but something in the man's eyes stopped her. They weren't offended. They weren't even distant. They were tired, deeply tired, but open. "She has an imagination that doesn't quit," Claire said finally, adjusting the strap of her scrubs. "And sometimes it lands us in trouble." Nicholas tilted his head, studying her. Up close, she didn't look like the polished, flawless women he usually saw at charity galas or company events. She looked real. Wisps of hair had escaped her bun, brushing against her temple. A faint smudge of ink stained her thumb, probably from filling out endless charts. There were circles beneath her eyes, exhaustion, not vanity. But there was also a steadiness in her posture, a quiet resilience that made her presence feel solid in a way that unsettled him. "And you?" he asked before he could stop himself. "Do you get into trouble too?" Her lips quirked despite herself. "Every day," she said dryly. "It comes with the job." Sophie leaned forward again, thrusting her crumpled drawing toward him. "Do you want to see my picture?" Nicholas hesitated only a second before taking it gently, careful not to tear the paper. "This is beautiful," he said honestly. "You drew this all by yourself?" Sophie nodded vigorously. "That's Mommy. That's me. And that's Daddy." Her finger pointed at the faceless figure. But I didn't know what he looks like. Claire's throat tightened. Sophie. But Nicholas spoke first, his voice soft. Maybe you don't have to know yet. Maybe you get to decide what he looks like. Sophie tilted her head, considering that. Like you? She asked. The question hit harder than Nicholas expected. He cleared his throat. Maybe like me, if that's what you want. Claire's heart clenched. It should have been uncomfortable, a stranger stepping into a wound so raw. Yet there was no arrogance in his tone, no careless charm, just gentleness. And for reasons she didn't want to examine, that scared her more than rudeness ever could. A voice called from down the hall. Claire, we need you in triage. She jolted, tightening her grip on Sophie. Coming. She turned back to Nicholas, clearly torn. Would you mind just keeping an eye on her for a second? I'll be right there. The request slipped out before she thought better of it. She realized it the moment the words left her mouth. She was a nurse, a mother, someone who trusted very few people. And yet something about this man, his calm, the way Sophie gravitated to him, made her gamble. Nicholas straightened in his chair. Of course, he said. Claire hesitated only a moment longer before hurrying down the corridor. Sophie wriggled free from her arms and immediately clambered into the chair beside Nicholas, her stuffed rabbit bouncing in her lap. She looked at him with a conspiratorial grin. Mommy doesn't let me eat candy here. Do you have candy? Nicholas chuckled, shaking his head. No candy. But I might have. He checked his pocket and pulled out a folded napkin with a doodle on it. It was just a few quick sketches he'd made earlier while waiting. Abstract shapes, half a face. Sophie's eyes widened. Can you draw a bunny? She asked eagerly. Nicholas nodded, taking the crayon she handed him. He bent over the paper, tongue pressing against the corner of his lip in concentration, and began to draw. Sophie leaned closer, watching as the simple lines became long ears, a round belly, a crooked smile. When he finished, she clapped. That's perfect. It looks just like Mr. Whiskers. Mr. Whiskers? She held up her one-eared stuffed rabbit proudly. See? Nicholas smiled, something loosening in his chest. He had forgotten what it felt like, to be needed for something small, to make someone happy without contracts or numbers or stakes. By the time Claire returned, breathless from rushing, Sophie was laughing. Really laughing. For the first time in days. Nicholas had drawn a second bunny wearing glasses, and Sophie was insisting it was the grandpa bunny. Claire froze in the doorway, her heart pulling in opposite directions. Relief, because Sophie was safe and smiling. Fear, because she had let a stranger hold her daughter's trust for even a few minutes. Thank you, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I shouldn't have asked you. I didn't have a choice. Nicholas folded the napkin carefully and handed it to Sophie, who hugged it like treasure. You're welcome, he said simply, and as Claire looked at him, really looked, she realized she couldn't quite read him. There was something hidden beneath the simple sweater and tired posture, something heavier than his silence. But Sophie didn't care about hidden truths. She only knew that for the first time in a long time, someone had made her laugh. And that, Claire thought uneasily, might be the most dangerous thing of all. Nicholas remained in the waiting room long after Claire disappeared into the maze of hallways again. Sophie sat cross-legged beside him on the chair, humming softly to herself as she colored the edge of the napkin drawing he had given her. For a moment, Nicholas simply watched her, the way her brow furrowed in concentration, the way she carefully shaded the bunny's ears as though it were a masterpiece. It was disarming. Children were disarming. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. This wasn't what he had planned when he left his penthouse earlier that evening. He had imagined an anonymous visit, a number scribbled on a clipboard, a meaningless checkup in a place where no one would recognize his name. But life had a way of mocking plans. Instead of silence, he had stumbled into a child's imagination, and worse, into a mother's weary trust. A part of him wanted to leave, to slip out before the illusion cracked. But his body didn't move. Something kept him anchored to that plastic chair, listening to Sophie hum as if it were the only sound worth hearing. His mind drifted back, to cold marble floors, cavernous dining rooms where his footsteps echoed, to the endless stream of assistants and advisors who spoke at him but rarely to him. His fortune, his empire, all of it had grown since the day his wife's illness took her away. And with each year, the more he built, the less he felt. Success became a shield, wealth a distraction. He signed documents, expanded holdings, gave speeches that journalists dissected for meaning. And yet, in every mirror he faced, he saw only hollowness. That was why he was here, in a place that smelled faintly of antiseptic and instant coffee, with its outdated posters and squeaky chairs. He could almost convince himself that he was no one. Not a CEO, not a benefactor, not a public figure. Just a man waiting for his name to be called. And yet even here, he couldn't hide from the truth pressing inside his chest. He wasn't invisible. Not to Sophie. Not to Claire. "Mommy works a lot," Sophie said suddenly, breaking into his thoughts. She had set down her crayons and was hugging her rabbit close. "Sometimes I sleep on that couch over there when she's busy." She pointed to a sagging sofa in the corner of the waiting area. Nicholas followed her gaze, noticing the faint indent in the cushions, the blanket folded neatly at one end. His throat tightened. "Do you like staying here?" he asked gently. Sophie shrugged in that honest way only children managed. "It's okay. Mommy makes it fun. She tells stories when she finishes with patience. Sometimes about castles, sometimes about dragons, but always about families." Nicholas swallowed hard. Castles, dragons, families, words that sounded like fairy tales to him now. Claire reappeared a moment later, flushed from rushing. She smiled at Sophie before meeting Nicholas's eyes, her voice apologetic. "Sorry. Emergencies don't wait." He shook his head. "You don't have to explain." But she did anyway. "It's like this most nights. Short staff, too many patients, and—" she glanced at Sophie. "Not enough childcare options." Nicholas noticed the way her hand lingered on Sophie's hair, smoothing it down automatically. He could see the weight pressing on her shoulders. Not just the exhaustion of a long shift, but the relentless burden of doing it alone. "Must be difficult," he said quietly. Claire gave a small, humorless laugh. "Difficult is a word, but you don't think about it when you have to keep going." Her eyes flicked to Sophie, softening. "She's worth every hard day." There was no self-pity in her tone, only resilience. Nicholas recognized it instantly, the same grit he had seen in hospital corridors years ago, when his wife was fighting her illness. That same quiet determination to keep moving, no matter how unfair the world felt. Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve. "Can we go home soon?" "Almost, honey." Claire kissed her forehead, then glanced back at Nicholas. "I didn't catch your name." For a heartbeat, Nicholas hesitated. He couldn't say Hale. "Not here. Not now." "Nicholas," he said finally. "Just Nicholas." Claire nodded politely, though her expression suggested she noticed the omission. "Well, Nicholas, thank you for keeping her company. She doesn't usually take to strangers." He shrugged lightly, masking the strange warmth her words stirred. "She's easy to like." Claire looked down at Sophie, who was already dozing against her arm, the rabbit clutched to her chest. Something in her expression softened, just for a moment, before she hid it again. They sat there in silence for a while, Claire watching the door for her next patient. Nicholas lost in the sound of Sophie's slow breaths. The world outside, with its skyscrapers and headlines, felt impossibly far away. Later, when Claire gathered her things and lifted Sophie into her arms, Nicholas found himself rising too. He shouldn't have cared. He should have let them walk out into the night without another word. But the sight of them, a mother carrying her child, tired but unyielding, rooted him to the floor. "Good night," he said softly. Claire paused, turning to look at him. Her eyes searched his face, as though trying to place him. But after a long moment, she simply nodded. "Good night, Nicholas." And then they were gone. He stood there, staring at the empty doorway, the echo of Sophie's small voice still ringing in his ears. "Daddy." It was ridiculous, dangerous, impossible. And yet, for the first time in years, Nicholas Hale wondered what it would feel like if it weren't. Rain started sometime after midnight and kept tapping at the clinic's windows long into the next afternoon. By the time Nicholas returned, the sky had turned the color of wet slate, and the hallway smelled like raincoats and coffee. He hadn't planned to come back so soon. He told himself it was because he needed to pick up lab results and confirm a follow-up. But the truth waited for him in a corner chair with a one-eared rabbit and a stack of crayons. Sophie spotted him first. She didn't shout or run. She just lifted her hand and wiggled her fingers in a quiet wave, as if greeting the moon through a bedroom window. Nicholas felt something unspool inside him. He lifted his hand back. "Back so soon?" Claire asked when she saw him, surprise flickering behind the tired professionalism in her eyes. "I forgot to ask about a few things," he said, then added, "and I owed someone a better bunny." Sophie gasped. "You brought him?" Nicholas lifted a folded envelope from his jacket. Inside, a fresh napkin drawing. The rabbit from yesterday, but now there was a little paper crown perched between his ears and tiny stars peppered around him like confetti. Sophie squealed and hugged the drawing to her chest. "Mr. Whiskers is a king now," Nicholas said solemnly. "He was always a king," Sophie corrected, then lowered her voice. "But don't tell him. He'll be bossy." Claire hid a smile. The expression didn't make her look younger so much as lighter, like somebody had opened a window in a room with stale air. "You really didn't have to," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why it felt good." The waiting room was less crowded than the night before. A TV hummed low in the corner, subtitles running beneath a daytime movie where two people argued in a thunderstorm and then inevitably kissed. A nurse at the desk jotted notes. Somewhere down the hall, a printer spat out papers in tired bursts. "Do you have to see the doctor?" Sophie asked, tugging his sleeve. "Later," Nicholas said. "First I have to meet someone very important." Sophie's eyes went round. "Who?" He leaned in like a man delivering state secrets. "The Queen of Rabbits." Sophie sat up straighter, instantly regal. "That's me." "Your Majesty," Nicholas said, bowing with a gravity that was somehow both teasing and reverent. "Might I read to you while we wait?" Claire blinked. "Read." Nicholas held up a slim paperback from the clinic's tiny shelf. A book about a lighthouse and a girl who learned to count stars when the fog rolled in. "If you don't mind," he added, looking to Claire for permission. He always looked to Claire for permission. He wasn't sure when that started, only that it felt correct. Claire hesitated for a breath and then nodded. "As long as you're okay staying right here." He didn't move from the chair. Sophie climbed into the one beside him, feet swinging, rabbit perched on her knee like a small, disreputable dignitary. Nicholas opened the book. His voice, when he began, surprised him. Low, even, careful with the words like they might break if rushed. "Once there was a lighthouse that blinked sleepily against the sea. He read, and Sophie leaned closer, so close he could feel the small warmth of her shoulder against his sleeve. He read about foghorns and tide charts and the way the girl learned to listen for ships long before she could see them. Sophie whispered questions, small exhalations of wonder that made the sentences feel alive. Claire drifted in and out of the room, checking vitals and bandages, and every time she passed, her eyes touched the two of them, then moved away quickly, as if afraid to stare in case the scene dissolved. When the chapter ended, Nicholas closed the cover. "What do you think?" he asked. Sophie considered, solemn as a judge. "The lighthouse is lonely, but it's trying not to be." Nicholas nodded once, as if she'd given the only answer that mattered. "That's a very brave thing to do." A pager crackled at the desk. "Claire? Room 3, someone called. She turned to go, then paused. "Sophie, snacks are in my locker. The apple is for later." Sophie wrinkled her nose. "Apples are for always later." "I can cut it," Nicholas offered. "If there's a knife." "We're not allowed sharp things," Sophie reported, as if tattling on an institution. "But we have a plastic dinosaur that bites crackers." Nicholas looked to Claire again. "Permission to deploy the dinosaur?" Against her will, a laugh escaped. "Fine, but small pieces." They discovered the dinosaur in a breakroom drawer. A green clamp with serrated teeth meant for kitchen bags but destined, clearly, for greater things. Nicholas helped Sophie bite crackers cleanly in half while she narrated battle strategies for herbivores. He poured water into a paper cup and showed her how to tip it without overflow. Small things, nothing things, the kind of things he hadn't done since. The memory came and went like a wave, leaving the shore damp but not drowned. He breathed. "Do you fix stuff?" Sophie asked when the dinosaur retired from service. "Sometimes," Nicholas said, "if I know what it's supposed to be." Sophie studied him like a riddle. Then she held up Mr. Whiskers. The one ear sagged dangerously, the seam split. "He's supposed to be brave," she said, "but his ear keeps falling." Nicholas examined the patient. "This is an advanced case. We don't have thread," Sophie said, face falling. Nicholas patted his pocket. He had nothing so practical. He had never been the kind of man who carried thread. He was, however, the kind of man whose wallet contained a membership card to a club he never visited. He placed it on the table and used the stiff corner as a makeshift backing. Then, with a careful twist of a paper clip and a strip torn from the inner flap of the envelope, he fashioned a tiny splint, wrapping it gently around the ear like a bandage and securing it with a single piece of clear tape from the nurse's station. Sophie's eyes widened. "You made him brave again." Nicholas smiled. "I think he always was. We just helped him remember." When Claire returned and saw the improvised surgery, something in her face went very still. She traced the tiny bandage with a fingertip. "You did this." He shrugged, suddenly self-conscious. "Temporary fix." "It's clever," she said. Her voice had gone soft in a way that made Nicholas want to look away. Praise at fundraisers slid off him like rain. This felt like sun. "Can we go outside?" Sophie asked. "I want to hear the rain." Claire checked the clock, the patient board, the weather. The downpour had gentled to a shiver. 5 minutes, she said. "Coats." They stood under the overhang by the ambulance bay, where the world smelled like wet pavement and pine. Rain stitched silver lines in the air. Cars hissed past. Sophie held Mr. Whiskers up to feel the weather. Solemn and unblinking, a tiny priest blessing a parking lot. Nicholas watched the reflection of the clinic sign puddle and reform with every drop. "My mom says rain makes the bad things go quiet," Sophie said. "Your mom is wise," Nicholas replied. Claire's gaze tilted up to the low clouds. "Rain doesn't fix anything," she murmured. "It just buys you a moment to breathe." Sometimes that's all a lighthouse needs, Nicholas said. She looked at him, surprised by the callback to the book she hadn't heard, and he realized she'd heard enough anyway, had been listening without standing still. The thought warmed him. Sophie began to count raindrops and lost track at 12. The wind pushed a curl against her forehead. Without thinking, Nicholas smoothed it back. Claire noticed, of course she noticed, and he pulled his hand away, apology on his tongue. But she only exhaled and said, "It's okay." And the words felt bigger than the gesture. Back inside, a new patient groaned in triage. The 5 minutes turned into 6, then 10, and the world tugged at Claire again. "Duty calls," she said, half to herself. To Sophie, "You stay with Nicholas. I'll be right there." Sophie saluted with the gravity of a queen's guard. Claire started to go, then paused, hand on the door, and looked back at him. "Thank you," she said. 2 words, ordinary as bread, with a ridiculous amount of meaning inside them. He took the seat again. Sophie climbed beside him, leaning until her shoulder found his. "When you read," she whispered, already sliding towards sleep, "the room doesn't feel like a hospital." Nicholas stared at the opposite wall, at a pinboard with reminders and a crooked calendar and a poster about hand-washing that had peeled at the corner. "Me either," he said. The TV in the corner switched from the movie to local news. Muted. On screen, a ticker crawled about road closures and a charity gala he'd forgotten he'd funded. He looked away before the camera found a face that used to belong to him. He focused on Sophie's breathing, the small weight of ordinary trust against his arm. He let the sound of rain through the vents be the room's whole music. When Claire returned, there was a softness around her eyes that hadn't been there before, like sleep in the seconds just after waking. "Shift's almost over," she said quietly. "Do you walk home?" Nicholas asked, keeping his voice light. "Usually," she said. "Buses get crowded at changeover. It's still raining." "We like the rain," Sophie mumbled, not fully awake. Nicholas didn't offer a car. He didn't offer anything that would tilt the balance. He only said, "I can carry the umbrella." Claire weighed the sentence, the man, the weather, the distance. Then she nodded once. "All right." He held the door while she lifted Sophie, while Mr. Whiskers bumped against her shoulder with medical dignity. They stepped into the damp evening together, 3 figures under a small circle of nylon sky, each holding something the others could not see. A paper crown, a makeshift bandage, and the quiet, treacherous hope that maybe, just maybe, lighthouses could be less lonely when someone else learned the tide. The rain had ended by morning, but the air carried that raw, metallic scent of streets rinsed clean. Claire balanced Sophie on her hip as they stepped back into the clinic, Rabbit tucked under the girl's arm like an honored guest. Nicholas was already there, seated with a folded newspaper that he wasn't really reading. The headline blurred before his eyes. All he truly noticed was Sophie's sleepy smile when she spotted him, as though he belonged here, as though it were natural for him to be waiting. "Morning," Claire said, cautious but not cold. She had told herself she wouldn't expect him again. Yet here he was, and her voice betrayed a flicker of relief she couldn't quite hide. "Morning," Nicholas replied. He looked almost sheepish, dressed in the same worn sweater. But his gaze softened when it landed on Sophie. "How's the king?" Sophie held up Mr. Whiskers proudly, his taped ear still intact. "Still brave." Claire gave Nicholas a long look, but before she could speak, a commotion broke out at the desk. A patient in a wheelchair shouted angrily about wait times, the nurse behind the counter fumbling to calm him. Phones rang, monitors beeped, voices layered over voices until the air felt stretched too thin. "Sophie, stay here," Claire said quickly, setting her daughter in a chair. "Don't move, okay?" But Sophie, curious as ever, slipped down almost at once, chasing a dropped crayon that rolled across the tiles. Nicholas reached to stop her, but she darted out of reach, the crayon leading her toward the side corridor. When Nicholas looked up again, she was gone. His pulse slammed into his throat. He rose so fast the newspaper slid to the floor. The hallway stretched in two directions, both lined with closed doors. He called her name softly first, then louder, "Sophie?" No answer. He spotted it then. A small pink shoe lying on its side near the service stairwell door, its strap twisted as if it had been tugged loose in her hurry. His stomach dropped. He pushed through the door, the hinges groaning. The stairwell was dim, smelling of mop water and metal. And there she was, 3 steps down, hugging her rabbit tight, her little shoulders shaking. Nicholas crouched immediately, not too close, voice low, steady. "Hey, there you are." Sophie lifted wet eyes, tears carving pale trails down her cheeks. "It was loud," she whispered. "I don't like when it's loud." "I don't either," Nicholas said. He extended his arms, not forcing, just offering. "But you're safe. I'm here." She hesitated only a moment before crossing the space, climbing into his embrace as if it had always been meant. She pressed her face against his shoulder and murmured again that word he hadn't expected to hear, the one that unraveled him. "Daddy." This time Nicholas didn't correct her. His arms tightened, steady as an anchor. "It's okay," he whispered into her hair. "I've got you." When he carried her back into the waiting room, the chaos had quieted. Claire turned, saw them, and froze. Relief washed over her features, followed by something sharper. Fear, awe, a question she couldn't voice. Sophie clung to Nicholas as though he were the only safe place in the building. Claire reached out instinctively, but Sophie refused to let go, her small fingers fisted in his sweater. Nicholas met Claire's gaze over the girl's head. His voice was quiet, steady, almost apologetic. "She was scared. That's all." Claire swallowed hard. She wanted to scold Sophie, to remind her not to run off, to remind herself not to trust strangers. But what echoed louder than reason was the sight of her daughter safe and calm in his arms, whispering a word she had never dared speak to anyone else. And in that suspended moment, Claire understood something that unsettled her more than anything else. It wasn't just Sophie who wanted him there. By the end of her shift, Claire's nerves were stretched thin. She had replayed the scene in the stairwell a dozen times. Sophie's trembling shoulders, Nicholas's steady arms, that dangerous word her daughter had spoken with such certainty. "Daddy." Claire wanted to dismiss it as a child's fantasy. But when she saw Sophie's peaceful face pressed into his sweater, something inside her shifted. She tried to push it away as she finished charting vitals and changing dressings. Tried to remind herself, he was just a man, just a stranger who happened to be kind. Yet every time she glanced toward the waiting room, Nicholas was still there, sitting quietly, keeping Sophie entertained with sketches on napkins and whispered stories about lighthouses and ships. He looked settled, like he belonged. When her shift finally ended, the waiting room had emptied out. The overhead TV played the evening news on mute, subtitles crawling across the bottom of the screen. Claire gathered her bag, checked Sophie's coat, and walked toward the door. "Good night," Nicholas said softly. She nodded, the words caught in her throat. But then Sophie tugged her hand, pointing up at the television. "Mommy, look, it's him." Claire turned. Her stomach dropped. On screen, in crisp footage, Nicholas stood behind a podium draped in the Hale Industries banner. The caption beneath him read, "Nicholas Hale announces $20 million fund for community clinics." It wasn't just a passing resemblance. It was him, in a tailored suit, his voice steady and commanding, reporters thrusting microphones forward. His image filled the screen, flanked by men in dark suits and the kind of importance that followed him like shadow. Claire's breath caught. The sweater, the modest posture, the quiet laughter with Sophie. All of it collided violently with this man on the screen, the man who carried the weight of empires in his name. She looked back at Nicholas. He hadn't moved, but his eyes met hers. He knew she'd seen, knew there was no hiding left. "Why?" she whispered, barely audible. "Why here? Why us?" He rose slowly, careful not to startle Sophie, who blinked between them in confusion. "Because I needed to be no one," he said. "And for a while, you let me." Claire's pulse hammered. She wanted to scream at him, to accuse him of lies, of letting her daughter believe in something that couldn't be real. But the words tangled in her chest. Because the truth was harder than anger. He hadn't lied with cruelty. He had simply hidden. Sophie tugged her sleeve again. "Mommy? What's wrong?" Claire swallowed, forcing her voice steady. "Nothing, honey." But her eyes never left Nicholas. He looked stripped bare without his disguise, without the safety of anonymity. And for the first time, she realized he wasn't untouchable at all. He was a man who had come here not for medicine, but for something rarer, something he hadn't even known how to ask for. Still, the walls around her heart slammed shut. "This can't work," she said, more to herself than to him. Nicholas's jaw tightened, but he only nodded. "I know." He watched them walk out into the cool night, the door swinging closed behind them. For a long time, he stood in the empty waiting room, his reflection staring back from the darkened window. And for the first time in years, Nicholas Hale wondered if even a man with everything could truly keep the one thing he wanted most. The days that followed were heavier than the rain that had soaked the city. Claire moved through them on instinct, preparing Sophie's breakfast, hurrying to shifts, folding laundry late at night. But her thoughts refused to let go of the image on the TV screen. Nicholas Hale. Not Nicholas, the quiet man in the waiting room. Not the stranger who mended Mr. Whiskers with tape and a paperclip. A man with a fortune, a company, and a world that had nothing to do with hers. She told herself it was better this way. Distance meant safety. Sophie didn't need confusion, didn't need to believe in something that could never last. Yet every night, as she tucked her daughter in, Sophie whispered the same question. "Will Daddy come back?" And Claire had no answer. One evening, Sophie drew another picture. This time, the faceless figure wasn't faceless anymore. She had given him dark eyes, a gentle smile, and the same sweater he always wore. Across the bottom, in uneven letters, she scrawled, "Me, Mommy, and Daddy." Claire's heart cracked as she held the paper. The next evening, a knock came at the door. She hesitated, pulse quickening. When she opened it, Nicholas stood there. Not in a suit, not surrounded by bodyguards, but alone, holding a children's book with a lighthouse on the cover. "I thought," he said quietly, "I might read her the ending." Sophie appeared at Claire's side before she could respond, eyes widening in delight. "You came back." She launched into his arms, clutching his neck. He closed his eyes, inhaling the small weight of her trust, and for once didn't feel like an intruder. Claire stepped aside slowly, allowing him in. The apartment was modest. A second-hand couch, walls decorated with Sophie's artwork, the faint smell of soup on the stove. Nicholas glanced around as if memorizing every detail, as if this ordinary space meant more than all the marble halls he'd ever walked. They sat at the kitchen table, Sophie nestled between them, while Nicholas opened the book. His voice filled the room, steady and warm, carrying them through storms and fog until the lighthouse shone again. By the final page, Sophie had drifted into sleep, her head on his shoulder, Mr. Whiskers tucked safely under her arm. Nicholas looked at Claire across the table. In her eyes, he saw the same war he felt inside himself. Fear, longing, disbelief. "I don't need someone to love my money," he said quietly, careful not to wake Sophie. "I need someone to love me, and she already does." The words hung between them, fragile and true. Claire swallowed, her defenses trembling. She wanted to resist, to remind him of the impossible distance between their lives. But the sight of Sophie curled safely against him silenced her arguments. For the first time in years, the apartment felt less like a battleground of exhaustion and more like a home. She nodded just once. It wasn't surrender, not yet, but it was permission. Nicholas exhaled, a small, disbelieving smile tugging at his lips. He leaned his head gently against Sophie's, his hand resting lightly on the back of her small shoulder. And as the rain began again outside, pattering softly against the window, the three of them sat together in the dim glow of the kitchen. Not a CEO, not a nurse, not a lonely child, but something simpler. A family, still forming, fragile as a lighthouse in fog, but steady.